Hey, and welcome back to another edition of Cherie and Elizabeth Talk Sports. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of Strides Forward, a podcast about women in running. And I am here with my good friend Elizabeth Emery, who is the host and producer of Hear Her Sports, which is a podcast about women in the sports space, elite athletes and other people in sports. Elizabeth, how are you doing?
I am doing really well, thanks. And you can see I have a new poster.
I'm
Isn't
so
it?
jealous.
I know I love it. I absolutely love
I
it.
love it.
And it feels very special because A, it is Serena, so how can it not be special? And B, it came all the way from France. So I don't know. I'm super
Nice.
excited about it. But that is not my news. My news is that in the last video, we talked about social media of female athletes, and also just by chance, my last guest, Helena Gilbert Snyder, talked about the exact same thing. And I loved her take just because she is only 23. And so, like hearing her perspective as a young athlete, it was really great. But anyway, in both of those conversations, I said that I would come up with social media to follow of female athletes that I
Ah,
enjoy and like and think are doing a really good job. So I'm going to give just a few examples and we'll post them below and you can follow them. And before I give those, I want to emphasize how important it is to follow social media female athletes. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a great person for social media. I do it, but I think the ones that I'm going to mention are really doing a good job. And what I like about them all is that it sort of gives an insight into their sport and, who they
nice.
are a little bit, but also about the sport. And so that to me is why I enjoy social media, is just to see, like what are athletes doing? What are their daily lives like? Anyway, so here's my list. So many of them, as you will see, have been guests on Hear Her Sports, but not all of them. So one of them is Elena Sonneson. She is a cross country skier who has been on the podcast. And you can find her at ASONNESYN. And I think I'm not going to say all that. We'll just post we'll
Right,
just
yeah.
post it below. Anyway, so she's a cross country skier and she is sort of on the cusp of making it into high level international competition. So she does go over and she does do World Cup racing, but she is not yet, medaling over there. So I just love her post because she talks about all of that and sort of the frustration and the excitement and sort of being a new athlete. It's just really fun. And she also does post a lot of, like personal stuff, like right now she's been in Italy and so she posts her meals and things like that. So that's
Right.
really great. She also has a really good blog. Like she did not make the Olympic team. It was sort of an aspirational goal, but she did think that it was going to be possible. And so she blogged about how that was just so disappointing not to make the team. And she had gotten sick. And so there were a lot of extenuating circumstances that led to her not making the team. And then sticking with cross country skiing, of course, Jessie Diggins. I mean,
Right.
I think she does
Yeah.
such a good job. She is so high level, but still her posts are very personal and it's just fun to watch. And it's, she's so exuberant that it's great. Then Lucinda Brand is a cyclist. She has been on the podcast. She is both a road cyclist and a cyclocross cyclist. And I recently re-looked at her Instagram for this, and it is really so good. There's such great photographs of her racing and of her time around the team bus. And I also think that she does a really nice job of her words. And like who knows at her level if it's actually her speaking, but I think it is.
Right.
And anyway, she's also really fun. So that's the one I like. And then we talked about booty shots last time. And when I was looking for a surfer to have on the podcast, it was really hard to find one that did not have booty shots because, they're in
Right.
bathing suits all the time. But Paige Alms was on the podcast and her feed is not booty shots. It's of her surfing. It's of her, like that lifestyle, the surfer
Right.
lifestyle. She lives in Hawaii. So all that is great. Then Erin Jackson, who is a speed skater. She just won gold medal at the
Right.
Olympics. And her feed is also really great because she is hilarious, and she posts really funny things. And it's also, her rise to the top was so, I mean, not unexpected, but very rapid. So, like, there is this sense of like, oh my gosh, I'm here. So I love that about her feed. And then Gabriella Reuter has also been on the podcast. She's an equestrian,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
I remember
I
hearing.
love her feed because she has a lot of videos of horse jumping. So
Yeah.
that's just it's just fun to watch. And she's at a level where the fences are really high, so it's quite amazing to watch. And she also has some training videos and photos, which I find really interesting because I don't think the first thing that you think of about horse riders is that they're having to train. So I find that very interesting, as much training as she's doing. And then Kirsty Peeples is a runner, trail runner. She's a coach, and she also is hilarious. Well, that seems to be my theme, is I like really funny people on Instagram. But she's funny, and she also runs with a lot of people, and she coaches, as I said. So it's a lot of her with the people that she coaches, and she also she writes a lot in her posts, so it's fun to read that. And she's also very insightful and really an incredibly good writer. So I love that as well. And then um, yesterday I went to the Espnw Summit virtually, and I found two others that I thought were really good. They were on a panel. One of them was Kendall Ellis, and the other is who is a track and field runner. And then Sabrina Ionescu, the basketball player, and both of their feeds, again, are all about the sport, are really interesting. And it was fun listening to Sabrina talk in the panel because she was saying in the bubble during the first bubble during the pandemic,
Right.
which was so successful, that she didn't socialize with anybody. And she was, because she was so serious, she wanted to win. She wasn't going to socialize and then, like have to figure out how to be competitive with these people she had just socialized with. So she is super serious. And that is clear from her feed. I mean, she's fun and everything, but it's clear that she's going to be playing basketball. So
Right.
anyway,
Right.
that's my list. And there's many more. And
Right.
it was uplifting to me to see that there are all of these women who are doing a great job showing who they are and talking about the sport.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say, you mentioned in there sort of finding athletes who aren't all about booty shots. And when I hear something like that, I think like, well, there's nothing wrong with it if that's really what you want to do and if that's what you're after. But I think for people like you and I, it's just not what we want to see. Like, I'm
Right.
just not interested in seeing lots of almost nudie type pictures of someone or, close to or more provocative or
Right.
they don't seem to be made for my eyes or my interests. And so, yeah, so I guess my only hesitation is that I don't ever wanna make it sound like, you know, I don't know, for my own personal like, that I'd necessarily be criticizing somebody outrightly about, like, "That's bad," or,
Yeah.
saying that they're doing something wrong necessarily, but I think it's very worth pointing out maybe your audience might be.
Right. And
And
it
yeah,
and this is why I mentioned the Helena episode, because she really expressed her sort of conflicted feelings along the same lines.
right,
Like, she didn't want to criticize, but she coaches young girls, and so from that perspective, she doesn't like the booty shots because she doesn't want
right,
that to be sort of their model.
right, right.
Anyway, it's worth
Yeah.
a listen. She said it much better than I just did.
Yeah, and I think it's worth having this conversation because I know it can be a real hot topic for people when people get criticized for being maybe too sexy or however you want to phrase it, having the booty shots. Let's just use
Right.
that as our as our way of describing it. And I just personally have to step back and say like, hey, maybe that's for you, but also I think it's just worth having these conversations thinking it through like why one might do this or why one might not want to look at it. So, yeah.
Right.
And I think that you and I are pretty clear on our stance that it's just not for us to look at or be a part of
Correct.
in any way.
Right. Right.
So, yeah. Yeah.
And unfortunately, the booty shots tend to rise to the top, or that's sort of my
It,
um, Yeah, my expectation is that it rises to the top, which means you have to dig further to get to this list that I just presented,
Right.
which is unfortunate because, in Helena's example, her students or the people that she's coaching, how do they find that if they don't know these names? And
Right.
then all that's arriving at your feet are the booty shots, and you think that that's all exists.
Right. Or that somehow that's what you should be doing. It can
Very
tend
true.
so
Yes,
so it
yes,
yeah, so it's
yes.
and we've talked about this before that it's not oh it's everything's not just about one individual doing one thing. It's also about the machine behind it. It's that
Correct.
interconnected web of things that plays into all of this. And the web can be algorithms in Instagram
Right.
that,
It's also just representation. Like if
yes,
you don't see someone like yourself, as in a person who's not interested in booty shots, you think that they don't exist. And then you
right.
should be interested in booty shots. And yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe there's something wrong with you that you aren't interested
right.
in being that person
Right.
or
Right.
or
Exactly.
following those
Exactly.
on and on and
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think having other examples of ways people can be is very great.
Yes. Well, I went on and on. So now what's been going on with you? I know that you are now back from Ireland.
I am. So I actually my update is about Ireland, and I'm going to keep it very positive because our media subject today is not. Although I'll try and put a positive spin on that sort of too. But so my update is about I was in Ireland. I lived in Ireland for a year. I have many good friends there, and I met them pretty much all through running. And so when I go back and visit my friends there, which I hadn't been able to do since before COVID, so it was very exciting. I spent a lot of time running with people and then having really nice meals afterward. And most of them are men that I run with. And so the first part of my update is just pointing out that as much as, we talk a lot about, misogyny and non-equity and things like that, my own personal experiences in sport, especially these days, feel very respected and equitable. And I don't feel like I'm trying to be one of the guys. I used to be that way a lot more when I was younger because that seemed to be the way in, and I don't feel the need to be that way anymore. And I just really feel like there's no like, oh, there's a girl with us today, or there's just no sentiment like that. And I just attribute that to the fact that like we're all good friends and we all love to do this thing together, and that's all that it needs to be.
Right.
And so that was really nice. And I also had the opportunity to be in Ireland when, oh, it just makes my heart so happy. The Katie Taylor fight was on. And anybody who's been following sports at all, this is not about women's sports. This is not about boxing. This is about being a sports enthusiast. Like, I don't follow boxing really at all, but I know who Katie Taylor is. And she had a huge match at Madison Square Garden that everyone was thrilled about. It was on the front page of the sports section in Ireland. It was all over the place. All my friends, men and women, were incredibly excited. Even my friend's father, who is quite a bit older and, you know, not really up on current events, and he was super excited about watching this Katie Taylor match. People were absolutely just over the moon about it, and we did not stay up and watch it live at 3:30 in the morning in Ireland because it was on in New York City, but we did get a chance to watch the highlights, and it was absolutely incredible. And Amanda Serrano, who she was up against in the match, fought an incredible fight. I mean, it was just absolutely down to the wire, very close decision. And it just makes my heart so happy. Like, it was such good sport. And we've talked about this before, Elizabeth, but it was like people just want to see good sports,
People just want to see good sports.
and this was incredible. And
Yeah.
again, back to just sort of my own experiences of being in the athletic space and watching women's sport sort of rising up, and when it does and people have the opportunity to like see something on television, or in this case we watched these really nicely put together highlights on YouTube, uh people just loved it. And it wasn't about like, oh, she's a girl and she fights like a girl, or none of that. It was just like, here's a great athlete, here are two great athletes, doing what they do so well and getting recognized for it, and it was absolutely awesome. So,
And they
yeah.
sold out Madison Square Garden.
And I was really paying attention to what was going on behind them too. People were so excited. Like, it makes me wanna cry. Like, it
Yeah.
was so great. So, yeah. Yeah,
And it's
so
so nice too because I actually wrote about this in the Hear Her Sports newsletter, and there are just some great quotes from both of them, both
yes,
Amanda and both of them, and of being so excited, of being respected, and having this venue, but like selling out Madison Square Garden,
unreal.
and having such a great fight, and
Yeah,
also again, we've talked about this in the past with other athletes, having the opportunity to show how great their sport is and how
yeah,
good they are. And that to me was just, it's so fantastic.
yeah. And all the support. It just
Yeah.
incredible support, top to bottom. Like, it's like, "Oh, this is how we can do it." And then if you're looking at it from a dollars and cents point,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
come on.
Yeah. Well, going back to the ESPNW Summit, there was this really great presentation by Nicole Lavoie, who runs the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women. And one of the things that she was trying to counter all of the negatives that come up about women's sports. So one of them she was pointing out is that, people often say, oh, no one watches women's sports. And she says, that's not true. And so what you have to do, and I just loved it because she was always during this whole presentation, she like really wanted us to present the reality of things. So she said, when you get presented with this, she said, take a time out and say, this is simply not true. And so I love it. I love this
Yeah,
fight because that is just another example that it's simply not true.
right,
And so
right,
I was really taken by Nicole's presentation, just like, we have to present the reality,
right,
instead of sort of perpetuating the myth of, no one watches women's sports.
right. It's to me, it's those are just such silly comments at this point. It's like, you don't have to like it. Like, I don't expect every person who would be saying something like that to suddenly become a big fan because women do sports well. But it's
Right.
just sort of like, well, just say that you don't like it. Like, I don't like watching baseball, but I'm not
Yeah.
saying that people shouldn't watch baseball or that
Right.
baseball is a terrible thing, or, it's just like,
Right.
it just isn't for me. That's all
Well,
right,
that's the other thing that she
you
said is
know?
when people say no one watches women's sports, what they're really telling you is that they don't watch women's
Right.
sports.
Yeah. It's like, it's okay.
Yeah.
I can think that, one of the people that I was hanging out a lot with in Ireland is really into rock climbing. I'm like, rock climbing is so cool. I don't do it,
Right.
but that doesn't mean that it isn't cool and awesome for many, many people.
Right.
It's
Right.
just like, you know, it's like,
Right.
I understand we can't do everything, but we
Yeah.
can respect what other people do and
Yeah.
that it's cool. Yeah.
The other funny thing that she said was really what's happening is all of the men involved in sports that are saying no one watches women's sports is what they're worried about is that the women's sports will eclipse the men's sports. And it's starting to happen.
Well, right, and, I certainly don't advocate for, like, women taking over the
No.
sports world, because, but, like, I don't know, like, a little 50-50. I
50-50
definitely
would be nice.
advocate
Yeah.
for that, and also,
Yeah.
and something I keep coming back to that's developing through our conversations here, Elizabeth, is not just women's sports, but also focusing on sports that women do well, which often aren't the sports that are focused on, right? Like
Correct. Right.
like yeah. So,
Right.
and I always talk about running and you always talk about cycling, and and there are lots of other examples that we could
Exactly.
get. So also raising up sports that just don't get the attention that I feel like they deserve, that we feel like
Yeah.
they deserve. So, well, listen, let's move on to our media section. And this is a downer, if you will, but worth the attention. And I don't know that we have to go on too much about it, other than the fact that I just wanted to bring up uh, the reality of women in sports journalism and point to really how awful it is for them, and that we owe them. I just it's just one of these frustrations, but I think that, again, like, recognizing how little coverage women get in sports, it's also important to recognize how little uh I don't even want to say the opportunity is for women to be behind the scenes so much as how poorly they're treated, so that even when there's opportunity, it's just like, who wants, like, it's hard to take because it can be so awful for people to do this job. And it's still happening. And what kicked this off for me is I was doing research for something else that we were doing, and I came across an article by Sarah Spain, who is a journalist for ESPN. She's very well known, very well respected. She's on TV. She's written on and on. And it was a story titled "When Will We Separate Women on TV from Their Bodies?" I was expecting it to be an article about talking about women in sports, and it wasn't. It was about talking about her, and it's from April 2018, but the time lapse, I don't really think makes any difference because I don't think things have changed a whole lot. There's been zero indication that things have changed, and many indications that they're very much the same to this day. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit, but I'll just quickly say that her story was about basically whatever she's posting, people just inevitably start talking about her body. She is large chested, and so she just gets these endless comments about her boobs. And it's ridiculous. It's horrible. She also goes on to talk about, that she has fake hair and fake tan and fake eyelashes because that's what it's about to be on
I was
TV as a
shocked by
woman.
that.
I was too. I don't feel like I should be, but I
I
am.
know, I
And,
know.
but she talks about sort of this no-win situation, and like anything she's tried just doesn't work, and it's just how really, really awful it is for her to do her job. And so that's awful. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of some other things that I ran across, but I just wanted to get your comments, Elizabeth, on this conversation.
Uh, well, one of the things that struck me because, I read the article, they have a photo of the post, the social media post that she was referring to where she got comments about her boobs. And I looked at it, I was like, oh my God, if you're looking at her boobs, you
Right.
are really looking for her boobs
Right.
because
It's
they just were not, I mean, they were covered by a bunch of 7-year-olds. I mean, she was
yes,
surrounded by a bunch of 7-year-old players, and I don't know, it was a face-on shot, so, like, there was no depth. So
exactly.
you're not really seeing that they're big. I just was like, "Oh my gosh, this is insane."
Yeah.
But I think that goes to her point,
Yes.
which is there's nothing to be done.
Right.
Like, regardless of the image, regardless of what she's wearing or blah blah blah, it's always going to come down to her boobs,
Right.
and it's
If that's
just
what people want to focus on. Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
But I will, again, commenting on the ESPNW Summit, which I will have to say, I hope they have replays of it because it was really good. So there was one panel that featured all Black women, and they were just talking about supporting one another. And so I just was uplifted that, yes, this is a very difficult space to be in. And they did talk about that, like being the only woman in the room oftentimes, being the only Black woman in the room oftentimes. But at the same time, they talked about, they supported one another in really significant ways. For example, they talked amongst themselves about, what their salaries were, what they were making, so that when a new person was trying to make a deal, they knew what was happening behind the scenes. And
Right.
so, like one of them was saying, we like to think that everybody's going to, negotiate in good faith and they're going to pay me as much as they're paying all the guys, but ha ha ha, that's not going to happen. But we
Yeah.
know. So I thought that was really good. I mean, I think we're at the point, it seemed like the field from their perspective was at the point that they're strong enough as a unit that they can proceed. So that
Yeah.
it made me feel a little bit better.
I'm glad you're bringing good news because I just brought a bunch of bad news.
I don't think, I still don't think it's great, but
Right.
like
But
it's
it's a
getting better.
step. Yeah.
Right. It
Yeah.
is a
And
step. Exactly.
yeah. Yeah. And I think the bonding together is really important. And other people brought this up in many of the articles that I read, that we just really need to be a force together and not have this situation where it's the single woman makes it through, but it's been so awful that she just doesn't have any energy left, or whatever the circumstance is, that she's not helping bring more people up, that, we're kind of, it seems like it's shifting, in
I
that
agree
way
with
of, yeah,
yeah. And I think often of the USA hockey team when they struck against USA Hockey, basically.
yeah,
And so all the upper tier women said that they weren't going to play. But
right,
in addition to doing that, so they bonded together as a unit, as a team. But in addition to doing that, they called basically every single hockey player in the United States and said, don't play for USA Hockey, because as a unit, it meant that they were stronger. And all the women got on board. I think, you know, all the way through college players. I mean, the USA
wow,
Hockey tried to go super deep to try to find people that they could send to, these major events so that they wouldn't have to deal with this strike. But, as a unit, it was impossible. So
yeah,
it was
yeah.
great. And then of course there's also soccer,
I was just gonna say, yeah, the soccer players did something very, very similar,
Right.
and yeah, yeah. So, yeah, so that's a good thing to perpetuate. And then the other thing that was brought up in the Sarah Spain article is that we need men to get on board. We need men
Totally.
to recognize that. I mean, they're the ones doing it, like, holding each other accountable, holding themselves accountable, and being good allies. We saw that again and again in these stories. I did want to point out, we love statistics and or data, and so I'm feeding that because you bring it up a lot, Elizabeth, and so I'm totally on board. So I'm going to read a couple of things uh from a couple other sources, not this source from ESPN, but there was another article from the Committee to Protect Journalism, and it was from 2019. But again, I believe that these things are still very relevant. And I'll just read this. In a report published this month, the Women's Media Center found that sports is the most male dominated subject in both print and internet news.
Oh, wow.
This we see again and again. I've read this in other accounts and in other places. I do believe that the Women's Media Center is U.S. I mean, they definitely U.S. based. I'm thinking their statistics are from the U.S., but I've seen this
I
play
think
out
they
in
are.
other
I think they
places
are.
too. Like in
Yeah.
Australia, the statistics looked very, very similar. And it says men led 90% of sports coverage in print, 90. It
Wow.
was the same in Australia from a more recent report that I found. And then 79% of the websites were men. And then there was also a bit in the Australian report that I read about that, men are also the people quoted about 80% of the time. So there's
Right.
that. And then this is going back to this quote from the Committee to Protect Journalism article. It says the center found that a prior report that female journalists were more likely to report stories about sexual abuse or domestic violence, and fan reactions towards journalists covering these issues can result in penalty that about these issues, which can result in penalties against athletes or teams, can be particularly strong. And we've seen that happen when women report on abuse by male athletes, or by men to women in sports. That there's a lot of backlash against the
Yeah.
journalists, and very, very nasty, violent, scary stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna say, I'll quote one more thing, and this is from the Women's Media Center in their 2019 status on women in the U.S. on women in U.S. media. And it says sports desks at 75 of the nation's newspapers and online news sites earned a B plus for racial diversity, a D plus for gender and racial diversity combined, and a sixth consecutive F for lack of gender equity,
Wow.
according to the Racial and Gender Report Card commissioned by the Associated Press sports editors. So, what that all adds up to is it's not just these anecdotal situations. It's not just, that one situation here, one situation there. Like, this is in sports media. This is a problem in sports media, as far as I can tell, very worldwide. And it's really despicable. I mean, I just don't, like, I could use lots of words, but it's just awful, and women just suffer discrimination and poor treatment, not only by coworkers and higher ups, And I read somewhere that it's sort of like, oh, the further the women go up the chain, like as they rise in prominence, the worse it gets for them.
Oh,
So it's
wow.
like, oh, what's the incentive to become more powerful? Is you're just going to get more backlash. And so not only does it come from inside, but also outside, of course, from fans, and people who follow sports. And I've heard this anecdotally in my own life, talking to women who report on sports, about getting comments about their voice, getting
Right.
comments about too much focus on. I mean, it just goes on and on. And it's just, at what point, and we've talked about this too, at what point are the sports editors going to say, we just won't put up with this? Like, it really is incumbent on the media
Sure.
outlets and the government and like all the powers that be to say this is enough. And we've seen situations where when that happens, it ends.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is
Well,
this is
I,
just discrimination, plain and simple. Plain and
well,
simple.
as you mentioned, it's time for men to step in
Yeah. Yeah.
or
And
step
the
up or
powers that
whatever.
be,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And the powers to be to say this is unacceptable, and it we're just not, that's not happening anymore. And they could, and they don't.
Right.
So,
I this has come up in my thoughts frequently over this past week. Is just, like, I just dream of the time when women can do their job and
there
not
you
have
go.
to think about all this extraneous stuff and just like sap their energy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I understand the world's not going to be perfect. There's always going to be jerks out there. But if we could just get to a point where it isn't just so horribly prominent, and that's
Yeah.
what the expectation is. And and you read, reading through, just in my own interest and also preparing for today, reading through articles about how people talk to women young women in journalism school, and it's about 50-50, if not more, women going into journalism. And a lot of them just go, or not just, a lot of them choose to go into communication and shy away from journalism, especially sports journalism, because of what they see.
Yeah. It
So we're
doesn't surprise me.
discouraging
Yeah.
very smart young women from pursuing what they would like to do because it's been made so horrible. And I think that sports writers, and I think that people who are in positions of power, should be horribly embarrassed. Horribly embarrassed. Like, it's just ugh. Anyway, yeah. I get so angry. I really, it's so incumbent on them to make things different.
Well,
Yeah.
if I weren't looking at the time and seeing 35 minutes, I would start talking about the New York Times sports section, but I will save that for next week
Yeah.
because that completely horrifies me. I've been like,
Yeah.
since we started talking about it, I've been looking more and more, and they should be embarrassed.
They really should. And you and I have talked about, and we'll get to this in an upcoming episode when we do decide what we're going to do, but you and I have talked about trying to make some action,
Yeah.
just to get a response, even, like, why do you operate this way, and why aren't you embarrassed, and why aren't you doing something about it?
Right.
So, we'll save that for another week. All right, Elizabeth. Well, we're going to sign off. Thanks so much for joining us one last time. I am Cherie Louise Turner of Strides Forward, and I am with my good friend Elizabeth Emery of Hear Her Sports. And we'll see you next week.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.